Well, I'm going to do a general presentation, then respond to some of the specific issues that have been raised here. But just in case people are not familiar with the Global Development Environment Institute at Tufts, basically one of our major missions is to try to subvert the teaching of economics and get some ideas in there about social and environmental perspectives, including some from post-Keynesian, including some from ecological economics, from other areas. And in particular, we have a macroeconomics text in which I've said here that we are 3 points that we are trying to get into that text are instability, inequality, and environment, which are typically lacking in most mainstream texts.
Move the mic down.
That? Okay. So we have tried over the years both to develop textbooks and also to have modules which are online and can be sort of slotted into an existing course. As I say, the goal is to subvert. The goal is to take mainstream teaching and shift it somewhat. And that puts us up against Dave Colander's 15% rule, that if you're doing a text, that you can only get in 15% innovative material or it won't fly in the mainstream, that people won't adopt it. So we're trying to push the envelope on that, maybe 30%, I don't know. But anyway, we're grappling with these issues of how to present innovative approaches in a macro textbook, in this case. We also have a micro textbook, environmental textbook, which will be adopted and which will be used. And what's always on our minds is that there are, in the US, something like 1 million students out there who are taking introductory economics, probably another 1 million in Europe, Canada, Australia, I don't know. And these people are all being fed a totally erroneous, totally misleading model. So we need to get in there, get into the trenches, and do something about that. And that sometimes means putting some purism aside and making some compromises. But I'll get to that in a minute. So this is the book, as I say, companion micro, and then a combination principles text in the second edition. And in the second edition, we've tried in particular to respond to what I call the new era, which is the post-crisis era, to deal with that with specific treatment of the financial crisis, with a chapter on debt and deficits, with, as Mark pointed out, expansion of the money and banking chapters. So here is the problem. If you look at mainstream texts, in general, they lack treatment of instability because of their assumption of long-run full employment. They lack treatment generally of inequality, little empirical assessment of increasing inequality, and no consideration of the relevance of inequality for macroeconomics. Environment and resource limits, only a very brief mention, often absent from the index entirely in macro texts. Environment is considered to be only a micro field within the mainstream. And very little treatment of infrastructure and social investment. Investment is basically business investment. The idea of government investment in infrastructure, social investment is a fundamental component of the economy, largely lacking. So how do we get at this? Well, one way is just sort of put them in here and there in chapters and appendices, bits and pieces. But the other issue that we grappled with is how do you deal with the basic model? The basic model in macro texts is aggregate supply, aggregate demand. It wasn't always that way. When I took introductory economics way back in the 1960s, we had basically Keynesian models. There wasn't any such thing as aggregate supply, aggregate demand models. Aggregate supply, aggregate demand models came to dominate completely, and is virtually impossible to get away with in a textbook. We considered, should we leave it out entirely? Should we have a Keynesian model? Should we have some discussion of money and monetary policy and not have aggregate supply, aggregate demand? Partly for the reasons that Dave Colander mentions, that you have to have something that will sell. We thought we should put it in there. But when we started to think about it, we thought that we might actually be able to do it and do it better. This is a standard. This is Mankiw. short-run aggregate supply, long-run aggregate supply, and then this vertical line in the middle is the long-run aggregate supply, which dominates essentially the whole model. No matter what happens in the short run, things automatically move back to the long-run aggregate supply. Government policy is ineffective. If you apply government policy, all it ends up doing in the long run is affecting the price level. So once you have that model on the table, then how can you talk about financial crisis? How can you talk about government stimulus programs? How can you talk about anything? Because you have the implicit assumption, the extreme classical assumption that the economy will take care of itself, that it will return to full employment equilibrium by itself, and that government policy is effectively ineffective. Mankiw and others wobble that a little bit. They say that government policy can be somewhat effective in the short term. Maybe it can get you back to full employment a little bit quicker, but at the cost of some inflation. And the problem is, if you accept this model, in particular this idea that there's a price equilibrium, that there's some magic price level at which the economy will come into equilibrium and everything will be fine, we'll have full employment, once you've bought into that, then you really can't get out of it. So is aggregate supply, aggregate demand model salvageable? Is there anything you can do with it? The reason we grappled with that is because we want to get in these issues, as I say, of inequality, environment, instability, and we wanted to see if there was a model we could put in there which would be good or at least not too bad, which students could comprehend, which would give them a way of thinking about this. So what we settled on was a sort of modified aggregate supply, aggregate demand, essentially with inflation rather than price on the vertical axis. That might not seem like much of a difference, but as I'll try to show, it makes it much easier to demonstrate inherent instability in the system, the possibility of active government policy response, the importance of distribution, and also to bring in consideration of things like resource and environmental limits. It sets up sort of a different framework. So how did we do it? For the aggregate supply, we basically go to the Phillips curve, which is an empirical curve showing inflation rising as the economy approaches full employment. We have the full employment not as a single position, but as a range. That Y star is the full employment range, a little bit below the absolute maximum capacity of the economy. And then we have a significant area here where the economy could be, where there's high unemployment, and the aggregate supply curve is more or less flat. There are very little inflationary pressure. So that's just a Phillips curve reversed, which we use as an aggregate supply curve, using, as I say, the inflation rate rather than a single price level on the vertical axis. Then the aggregate demand curve is added to that. There's a question about sort of what gives you slope on that aggregate demand curve, and a debate as to whether that should be some market effects, wealth effects, interest rate effects, or whether it's a Federal Reserve reaction function. I think myself that's not the most important issue. What is important is that aggregate demand curve is not a curve which is responding to prices. It's a summary of equilibria, which are Keynesian equilibria. So it's basically a Keynesian style equilibrium together with a Phillips curve, and once you have those two put together, they can move around, and there's no presumption that they're going to return to that full employment range. Because going backwards first, going from AD1 to AD0 would be a crisis, a collapse in demand. This doesn't indicate what the financial causes of that collapse or other causes might be. But if you went the other way, if you have a collapse in demand, then you're stuck here. You have high unemployment. There's no necessary reason why the economy should return to full employment, but government policies could push it back, AD0 to AD1. So that's a simple way of viewing the world, something which is easily graspable by students. But I think it's much, much better than the standard aggregate supply, aggregate demand. There are a lot of points that you could debate about it, but I think so long as you're looking at it as a non-equilibrium logic, but a logic of shifts in aggregate demand along a reverse Phillips curve aggregate supply curve, then you have a potentially unstable system that can shift around. So what that means is that all the factors affecting the positions of aggregate supply and aggregate demand are the proper domain of economic analysis and policy, that you can't simply rely on efficient markets to bring you back to full employment. There's no single equilibrium price level for the macroeconomy. Factors like money illusion and rational expectations aren't needed to explain short-term changes or long-term changes. Different equilibria, disequilibria, varied growth paths can exist. The inherent instability can affect investment, you get accelerator, negative accelerator effects, and you're back, in effect, in a Keynesian world. But it's called aggregate supply, aggregate demand, so that, as Dave Pollender points out, may persuade the publishers that this is okay, that you can have this as a text for introductory students. Okay, given that sort of basis where we have a more Keynesian, less stable, non-classical perspective, then we can bring in some of these other perspectives, such as, for example, environmental issues, which we have in several places in the text. We deal with environmental issues, such as here is the correlation of GDP per capita, GDP growth with CO2 emissions. And basically, of course, it's a positive correlation, but you also see that there are major differences between some countries in terms of at particular levels of income, you can have widely different CO2 emissions. So that has significant implications for policy. There are different potential growth paths. In particular, for the developing world, there could be growth paths which are relatively low CO2 emission paths. In any case, you can talk about CO2 emissions and other environmental effects as one of the important areas for macroeconomics to think about. Inequality, we've probably seen this graph in a couple of presentations at this conference, but we present it and discuss it at some length in several places and talk about the relationship between inequality of incomes and stability or instability of the macroeconomy. Again, fairly common sense. You have a broad middle class, then that gives the economy stability. You have a highly unequal income distribution, it creates inherent instability. You can see that the peaks of instability are just before the 1929 crash, and now. So that's something students can grasp. Some of the more sophisticated stuff, which we've been listening and hearing in this conference, may be difficult for introductory students, but I think they can get that point. Also, if you move away from the sanctity of that long-run stable equilibrium, you can talk about the possibility of whole other approaches to GDP. Talking about the genuine progress indicator, which subtracts environmental and social negatives from GDP. There are now a whole range of other indicators, alternative indicators, which can be brought in. We have a whole chapter on that. And this is Peter Victor's model for Canada, showing what you know, a stabilization of GDP and end to GDP growth. So again, getting away from the model that GDP automatically and exponentially grows, here's an idea that through capable management, you could stabilize GDP, bring down unemployment and poverty, and GHG is greenhouse gases, bring down greenhouse gas emissions, and you could have a prosperous environment that stabilizing GDP, ending growth would not be a terrible thing. So radical idea from Peter Victor, which we managed to get in there also into the text. Okay, if we take this sort of non-classical approach, then that doesn't necessarily have to go along with greening or environmental macroeconomics, but it opens up the possibility of it. The revised national income accounts and different ways of measuring GDP is one way of getting in significant environmental factors. Once you have the acceptance that Keynesian-type policies can work, you can talk about green Keynesian policies, social investment for full employment, use of carbon tax and resource taxes, and the possibility of limits to growth overall. Okay, is this a fairy story? No. It's not that difficult to find examples of successful Keynesian and green Keynesian policies. Here's the US, this is the Obama stimulus package. Within that, about a tenth of it, it's actually ended up being slightly larger than 787, about $800 billion. About a tenth of it goes for green, specifically green investment, so energy efficiency, smart grid, conservation, weatherization, energy efficiency, public transit, high-speed rail, environmental cleanup, and research. Was this all a waste of money, as the classical approach might tell you? Well, according to Blinder and Sandy, who fairly mainstream, somewhat Keynesian analysis, that without this stimulus, GDP would be about 11% lower than it was, doubling the already huge unemployment. Payroll employment would be less by some 8.5 million jobs, and the nation would be experiencing deflation. So that would seem to be fairly significant. Again, there's a common sense point that students should be able to grasp, and it has some reliable empirical economics behind it. Here's a case from Portugal. Before austerity and before you couldn't afford to spend anything on anything, Portugal decided to lead a transition away from fossil fuels towards renewable power and put the percentage of renewable supply in their grid up from 17% to 45% in a period of 5 years. Okay. They did that with government investment, so government-led investment, modernizing the electrical grid, developing wind and hydropower facilities. I don't have figures on what the employment creation was, but undoubtedly there was significant employment creation around that. They'll get carbon credits, and they will save forever billions a year on avoided fossil fuel imports. So sounds like a win-win approach, right? Good for the environment, good for employment, good for the economy. What's wrong with it? Well, as I say, we're not in the text advocating, as we're not saying these are the policies we advocate, but these policies become very conceivable, very logical, once you have a more open, more Keynesian approach to the macroeconomy. So increased hiring in the public sector, energy efficiency and renewables investment, building retrofit, all of this is what I call green Keynesianism. Increased public R&D expenditure is extremely important. R&D is pathetically low. The major advances of earlier periods, the Sputnik space program, etc., when it was accepted that the government should take a lead here, that we've moved away from, but we could move back to it. We could have significant R&D with enormous private sector benefits. Investment in things like public transit and infrastructure comes more expensive, but also has significant long-term benefits. So you basically open the door to all of this. Specifically in terms of environment and climate, you can use the tax system, you can recycle revenues, as I say, R&D investment, infrastructure investment, efficiency standards, preferential credit or subsidy for energy efficiency investment. All this just plays around with Keynesian policy tools, but applies them to a new reality and new challenges. Okay, well, of course, we can't do any of this because it'll push us into deficit. And particularly in Europe, we already are crippled with debt, so you can't even think about any of that, right? Well, Paul Krugman, who has taken a few hits here, I notice, said something that I thought made sense, which is that if the government uses borrowed money to buy useful things like infrastructure, the true social costs will be very low. The spending will put resources to work that would otherwise be unemployed. The argument that government debt can't cure debt, that is, government debt can't cure private debt, is just wrong. So while, as I say, people here who seem to have some differences with Krugman on this point, I think he's quite right. And that, again, is a common sense statement, easily graspable by introductory students. Europe has shown an unwillingness, particularly Germany, unfortunately, has shown an unwillingness to use these policies to allow indebted players to recover. Austerity policies, again, as there's been much discussion of here, make things worse. U.S. focus on debt reduction, though not so bad as Europe, prevents further stimulus and leaves the recovery weak. And all of this stuff, all of this austerity logic is based on what Keynes called the Treasury view, or Herbert Hoover economics, to balance the budget during recession. So if you put that aside, as if you put aside this deficit debt can't do anything logic, then you can come to some moderately radical conclusions. That if you break with that, fundamental long-run supply curve, automatic full employment logic, then returning to a more Keynesian dynamic model allows instructors to address these problems of instability, inequality, and environment. Doesn't necessarily prescribe specific policies. I have sort of prescribed some here, but we don't do that exactly in the text. But it opens up enormous possibilities for constructive, activist macroeconomic policy. How's the time?
Oh, wonderful. You have 1 more minute.
1 more minute. Excellent. Okay, well, that will allow me to show just a couple of our other offerings. I've been talking about the principles level, but there's also the vast area of advanced economics courses. We have specifically an environmental text, and there we do sort of the opposite. Instead of trying to put environment in macro, we try to put macro into the environment. Most environmental texts are all micro. We try and talk about macro logic, some green Keynesianism, and the macro picture of large-scale environmental problems. And then for instructors who may not want to go entirely with one of our texts or some other more radical text, we have modules on specific topics. These are climate change and renewable energy, but we also have them on taxes and working on one on inequality. So this could be put in for a week or two in the course.